Hello there. Dee Longhurst, the editor of the UK magazine The Transactional Analyst, has asked me to record the article that's going into the edition at the moment in spring-summer 2024. So I'll do that now. I'm not going to do it in a formal way, so I've got the article on my laptop and I'll make my way through it. So the article's entitled Psychosis of the Normative. Following the UKATA conference, Bradford 2024, me, Andy Williams, offers an article based on my remarks as the opening speaker. Background. It was with great joy that I was commissioned to provide the opening address at the UKATA National Conference, Bradford 2024. The theme of the event was a temporal one: who we have been, who we are now, and who we will be tomorrow. Changing times in transactional analysis. Curiosity led me to consult AI and specifically ChatGPT to gain insights into the future of TA. Although slightly muted, the response held some promise, hinting at a future where all fields of TA are integrated and technology, including AI, plays a significant role in its application. Having looked forward, it was now time to look back and consider the conference's more resounding theme: 50 years since the foundation of the then ITA, which was the Institute of TA, and its more recent iteration, UKATA, United Kingdom Association for Transactional Analysis. I noticed how the conference theme took me to some potentially vulnerable places. Inherently, as a transactional analyst, it took me to places of story and script. It took me to potential places of shame in how I have sometimes mismanaged my story for myself. The theme took me to issues of context: how hard our developmental environments might have been, family, culture, work, and the organisations we find ourselves in. I was reminded of that frequent idea in TA that we have made it this far, our script having provided the goods we needed to get us through to this point in our lives. So, potentially, the conference's theme connected me to ideas of homonymy, interconnectedness, and the possibility of places of joy, liberation, emancipation, and freedom. My intention in welcoming conference delegates to Bradford was to initially orientate them to the psychogeography and history of Bradford, as well as offering disorientation around the concept of normativity, the accepted, and where this leaves us with the modality we call TA, its epistemology, theory, and practice. Just going to move down a page. There we go. So the next section is called The Psychosis of the Normative. I entitled my talk The Psychosis of the Normative in honour of Andrew's 2016 work on the psychosis of whiteness. In his writing, he describes the discipline of critical whiteness studies. The process of whiteness needs to be uncovered and, I guess, disconnected from its abusive power sources in order that it can be exposed and reasoned with. Andrews, 2016, however, argues that whiteness is a process that is so deeply rooted in the social structure that it induces a form of sociocultural psychosis framed by its irrationality, so entrenched that it moves beyond rational engagement. In his original paper, he describes how these perversions of truth are maintained through film and media depictions. This idea of a maintained psychosis, entrenched in the normative power structures, has deeply fascinated me. I have wondered how this idea might be extended beyond the racial, as described by Andrews, to concepts of transactional analysis theory. How might we have become psychotic as transactional analysts entrenched in theoretical ideas that somehow support circuitous, self-reinforcing maintenance processes of misplaced power, historical and enacted again and again over time. The antidote to white psychosis seems to me to be contained in the work of Christina Sharp and her book on blackness and being, The Wake. In this profoundly lyrical piece, she uses the metaphor of the transatlantic slave ship and the wake that these ships used to produce as they scored the ocean surface on their journeys. She describes the wakes from these ships' journeys as persisting, that we're still impacted and existing in the wake right now. Far from moving on, we are still present in a time of racism and abuse. The psychosis persists. Andrews, 2016, argues that whiteness requires a light to be shone upon it, so it can be dismantled, addressed, and overcome. Why? For the essential liberation of all people around the globe. Can rational processes uncover the colonizing processes of whiteness? Critical whiteness suggests that these processes are so irrational, so deep that they are beyond any rational engagement. Whiteness cannot be reasoned with through rational teachings and debate. It is a psychosis hallmarked by a distorted view of reality. As I make these points of race, colour, intersectionality and power, I am of course using this as in juxtaposition with the Academy of TA theory. I was confronted to read the other day that there is no such thing as a non-racist. I may be racist, or I can engage in the process of being anti-racist, but the insipid neutrality of being a non-racist just doesn't cut it. Claude Steiner said the same thing years ago. He described the personal failure of those who might remain neutral in an oppressive situation. A fine statement of principle. Or, I guess, a statement of privilege from a white male who might have had access to resources and a societal position. I'm not judging, but I'm keeping myself open and aware that challenging the status quo may be a luxury only afforded to those of a certain powerful position. I want to invite us to ask ourselves, is this the same for normativity and the constructs of what is normal and what isn't? Is this an irrationality that cannot be reasoned with? If this is the case, where does this leave us with TA theories? As we look back, as we look in the present, and as we look to the future, where am I being psychotic? Firmly believing that up is down, left is right, and engaged in hallucinations? Or is my ability to mentalise and engage with critique fully functional, open to newness, creativity, curiosity, and debate? I've attended at least 15 TA conferences and remember one of my first. As a new green student, I encountered Mary Cox. At the time, me as a newbie, I was terrified. Mary presented a pre-conference institute workshop entitled The Baby and the Bathwater. Most of it went over my head, but what I managed to access was her valuing of some early TA theory. Today, Alistair Moody from Scotland, who was present at the Bradford conference, is an equally strong bastion of returning to the early texts and seeing what Byrne wrote and said, and the value or otherwise of the source material. A few weeks ago, many of us were in the Lake District at the Cumbrian TA conference. We were lucky to hear a keynote speech by Helen Rowland, a Boudica-like character from Peebles, who guards the Scottish borders with her particular intellectual bent. Central to her presentation at that time was her argument that TA has been struggling with its epistemology and indeed its ontology. In brief, do we come from a positivist, empirical, numerical, medical position, with a truth that can be empirically demonstrated, or do we come from some alternative position or philosophy? I find myself at home as a critical realist. I believe in constructivism, emergent and co-creative reality, the truth, for example, emerging in the intersubjective relational field. Helen will soon publish more work on these developments and arguments. I experience TA's confusion over its epistemology as somewhat like a wooden stool with legs of uneven length. I can occupy my seat, but never with certainty or surety. It causes me constant suspicion or critique of theory, and I wonder about the glue between the theory of knowing and normative power. I'm uncomfortable in their potential corrupt partnership. O'Neill, in 1966, in Sources of Normativity, declares the lack of innocence of normativity. She describes normativity as all-pervasive and demanding of self and others. We do not merely have beliefs, but claim that we and others should hold certain beliefs. We do not merely have desires, we claim that we should act on some of those, but not others. We assume that when somebody believes or does may be judged reasonable or unreasonable, right or wrong, good or bad, that is answerable to standards and norms. Christine Korsgaard in 1996 raises the normative question that even ethical standards are normative. We can very quickly introduce the ideas of power. Ethical standards do not merely describe a way in which we in fact regulate our conduct. They actually make claims on us. They command, oblige, recommend or guide, or at least when we evoke them, we make claim on one another. When I claim that an action is right, I also say that you and I should do it. When I say something is good, I recommend it as worthy of your choice. We can extend these ideas to knowledge, beauty, meaning, virtue or justice. All have normative dimension, for they tell us what to think, what to like, what to say, what to do, and what to be. I'm not cursing our world, but I am inviting us to notice that the normative is forceful and holds power. It leads to concepts that produce rules and laws. Let's look at the world of the trainee TA psychotherapist. If you're a trainee psychotherapist, someone has decided the norm for you, not only for the amount, but also for the pattern of personal therapy. They, whoever they are, have stated that 40 hours of therapy per year is better than 38 hours a year, and that it must be weekly and take place over a minimum of 4 years for certain TA psychotherapy qualifications. Work by Karen Miniken and Keith Chinnick and others has moved us deeply into power issues, colonial subterfuge and abusive processes resulting in alienation. Karen describes a movement from the normative, medical or positivist model of old to a resurrection and renewing of the radical psychiatric movement. With its background in the 1960s and the civil rights movement ablaze, Karen reminds us of the move towards the collective and the support of the community. It's a bit of a theoretical stretch, but I draw our attention to potentially the establishment of new social, political and psychological collectives. Joe Moores in Manchester and colleagues offer radical social media spaces to coalesce neurodiverse communities. Neil Keenan in the West Country is writing about these connections. Susie Hewitt from Bolton, near Manchester, is offering a new systemical focused training in TA. And it could be argued that TA East London is offering a radical community focused on the mutuality of teaching and learning through the courage and determination of Victoria Baskerville. Keith Tudor from New Zealand has offered many keynote speeches, standing on platforms and offering a traditional Maori greeting, bringing indigeneity and connection to the landscape into the space. I want to celebrate the courage, writings and practice of Hayley Marshall, Carol Wayne, Giles Barrow, Rosalind Sharples, Helen Blackburn, Bex Elston, and Baron Aldridge as they move us into the indigenous and the ecological. They invite us to stare into the inferno of climate crisis. As transactional analysts, how do we hold together vastly differing theoretical ideas in juxtaposition? For example, a traditional, maybe potentially linear treatment plan from Patricia Clarkson, alongside concepts of soul, soil and society, and the valuing of the encounter rather than the product, work by Giles Barrow. Giles too offers us a model of alienation, but this time at the ecological level. Soil, soul and society, the alienation he mentions is one of the severing of the healing connection to self, soul, others, society, and the very soil upon which we walk. Perhaps we can witness the psychosis of the normative more vividly in climate crisis than anywhere else. Continuing with business as usual has already cost millions of human and more than human lives. As I write, I can experience the light touch of gold leaf falling through my fingers as precious, irreplaceable vitality, physis, and diverse DNAs are lost from our world with exponential acceleration on a daily basis. As transactional analysts, the disturbance and dynamic flow can feel unbearable. At times it feels like drowning. Jane and I went to see a stage production of A Life of Pi, which includes a powerful scene of a shipwreck. For those of you who don't know the story, the boat is full of zoo animals, many of whom drown as the merchant ship sinks. In these circumstances, which one of us wouldn't reach out to grab for some flotsam or jetsam, or some normative certainty? I'm minded at this point of inclusivity and cultural difference and diversity. There are those of us who, through a whole range of neurodiversities and trauma histories, may experience disturbance and shipwreck every day. Some have survived real, concrete war and have experienced the shattering of concrete, tasted brick dust, and have had their hearing dulled by bombs and missiles. As transactional analysts, we can be tempted to speak of liminality occupying the dystonic in-between space. This model of liminality does imply that there is something solid on the other side, a clear destination or goal. In my NHS days as a tertiary psychotherapist, I've worked with many refugees and asylum seekers. Their courage and fortitude to bear uncertainty and endless liminality were deeply humbling. Many were cast adrift on an endless legal process with no metaphorical port or harbour to offer landing and safe haven. Their resilience frequently far outdid my ability to stay with the process. At times I would run home seeking the succour of Western home comforts to avoid the searing and unbearable disturbance of a normativity so different to mine. Their liminal space became their normative. Normativity can trap us and trip us up. A couple of years ago, I was facilitating an intensive weekend of UKATA. I was energised, enthusiastic, and deeply immersed in my white, male, Western privileged culture. I began to enthuse about woods and forests, their inherent healing nature, and with several group members I've missed a bit here. I began to enthuse about woods and forests, their inherent healing nature, and their use as landscape and narrative. I failed to notice the deepening loss of contact in the group, with several group members perhaps dissociating or drifting away. One woman began to speak. For you, the woods represent greenness and healing. For me, the forest represents border crossings at night, running for my life with branches hitting me in the face, bribery, sexual violence, and hidden barbed wire. My point is that normativity can be inherently a privileged position that we need to become aware of as transactional analysts, to be alert to, and to maintain a useful critique. Several years ago, I remember having a conversation with Adrian Lee, the woman who famously yelled at me from the back of the Byrne Institute training room, "Andy, get back in your fucking boots." One of the most valuable interventions that I've ever been afforded. Her message is at the heart of this paper: start with yourself and hold on to your courage as you embark on this terrifying journey of discovering who you are as a transactional analyst. Don't mimic, comply, or over-adapt. Learn who you are, and above all, don't swallow the myth of theory whole or believe it to be a concrete truth. Adrienne, in her discourses on liminality, said to me, "We are guardians of the grey," a position that I find engaging for two reasons. Our challenges as TA practitioners from every field is to learn to tolerate and sit with dynamic uncertainty. I would suggest that we're not entitled to hold black or white positions. Instead, we are commissioned to sit in the grey. This is a position of liminality, curiosity, creativity, and perhaps acute discomfort and risk. The second reason I love being called a guardian of the grey is that it sounds like a character from Lord of the Rings. There's nothing like striking your staff on the ground and shouting, "You shall not pass." Trusting and adhering to a normative position has to involve a process of othering. To understand this subject, colleagues such as Jayakara have taught me that if I want to discuss issues of intersectionality, I or we need to start always with ourselves. In my original talk, at this point, I moved on to a queer timeline. Parts of my presentation at the UKATA conference was a queer timeline covering the 50 years of the existence of the ITA in UKATA. Remaining on topic, I wanted to demonstrate how fickle normativity is, the very psychosis that anything is normal and will remain the same. A queer timeline of 50 years does demonstrate that what is considered normal changes, often through processes that continue to serve those with power. It is the powerful that get to decide the norm, and again, how might this idea be moved across in consideration of TA theory? So in the published written paper, there is now a figure 1 diagram of that queer timeline. I'll move beyond that now to the next section, knowledge as opposed to knowing. In March 2020, Keith Tudor was to address an Italian conference. I believe this event was disturbed by COVID, but he published his conference paper describing the challenges of our time. Keith described 3 challenges: rapid change, innovation, and uncertainty. And I would add a 4th challenge, that of certainty. This is especially relevant to my history and training to become a transactional analyst. In that ancient day, theory was presented as normative certainty. I was trained to know and to ask the client, "What is wrong with you?" I would like to compare this to a different epistemological stance urgently, which is, rather than "I know," I am knowledgeable but don't know, and I'd like to ask the client not "What is wrong with you?" but "What is your story? What has happened to you?" Just move my page down. Being knowledgeable rather than knowing implies a certain indigeneity, a wisdom, a connection to our past, our ancestry, to the underground ancient aquifers of our knowledge and theory base, rather than a rigidity of empirical positivism. I'm always interested in the difference between ghosts and ancestors. For me, ghosts are cut off, distressed, incomplete, and unsettled. Ancestors are all about connection and indeed reciprocity. Our ancestry is connected to our past, our present, and inherently linked to our shared TA-cultured future. Through well-curated ancestry, we are connected to our TA past, and the TA past can have a safe and useful voice in the present. Knowing, for me, can be deadening. It feels cut off, immutable, and too certain for its own good. There is an investment that lacks openness to development. Knowing cannot tolerate uncertainty and inherently rejects an iterative process. Tudor makes the point that life is inherently uncertain, whereas much of the literature on psychology focuses on attempting to make things certain. Terms and conditions are defined and situational practices are defended. We could see certainty as a way of maintaining dogma and dogmatism, an attempt to control the complex. Jacob Marino, founder of psychodrama, states that for a person to enter a new territory, a person must tolerate uncertainty and ambiguity. Certainly there is a cost to this. I think back to the shipwreck and the potential sense of chaos. I notice in my desire to survive and reduce my terror that I reach out to grab something that appears certain and, most importantly in the context of a shipwreck, floats. Gordon, 2003, describes of the impermanence of being and towards a psychology of uncertainty. The universe is an emergent, self-organizing system of exquisite complexity, continuously evolving within an interpenetrating web of co-creative relationships. This is a normativity that I can recognize and sign up to. Bill Cornell in 2007 said, he speaks to us of the inevitability of uncertainty, the necessity of doubt, and the development of trust. So, concluding remarks now, the danger of this article or this talk is to invite you into my normativity, as if I might have it right. Come and live and think like me. Those of you who know or are close to me would know what a very bad idea this might be. So, in one sense, this paper can have no conclusion. Instead, I would hope for an openness and spaciousness, a welcome sense of the dystonic and welcome disturbance. So I'd like to end by thanking the colleagues around me who have supported me with their brilliant thinking and helpful disruption. I'm deeply drawn to pluralistic ways of thinking. Karen Miniken, 2021, invites us to pursue social, political and psychological pluralism. Karen positions the norm as a dominant collective narrative that is seductive, and I would add psychotic. It's hidden and difficult to expose, difficult to exchange with and change. Karen leaves us proposing a flexible, non-dogmatic approach, paying attention to our client's own meaning-making process as a powerful antidote to oppression. I adore the cruelty, blood, guts and gore and darkness of the original Cinderella story. Toes were cut off, heels pared with a knife, so that an ugly sister could attempt to fit her large, flappy foot into a tiny magical slipper. If we ignore the dire misogyny for a moment, what we're left with is a beautiful model of how TA can go wrong. At times, we risk over-investing in archaic models and attempt to force ourselves, our training programs, and our clients into this misshapen pair of shoes. Don't get me wrong, I want to respect the ancestors. Mary Cox and Alistair Moody were and are right. Be accurate in knowing our TA history and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. However, I must also be liberated from the tyranny of outdated norms and theories. Mercifully, help is at hand. The landscape of the Scottish borders is heaving and groaning. The ancient Celtic warrior of Helen Boudica Rowland is stirring and writing, and I believe will be part of our epistemological rescue. In the meantime, I need to quieten my soul, to be satisfied with knowledge rather than knowing, and to ask others, What is your story? What's happened to you? Rather than trust any normativity or seek out models of pathology.